in lots of different so the opportunity for early intervention, early relational intervention in particular, um, we know that early intervention can make a difference from evidence that's kind of from international evidence, potentially larger than at any other time um, in childhood. Of course, it's important that we offer support to children and families at all stages through childhood. But there's something special about what happens in the early years, and important about those early relationships and driving children's development, but also in creating these really important opportunities for well-being, happiness, joy, connection in the here and now of children's lives as well, and families' lives. Effective programs can, in theory, have a range of benefits for children, but that developmental science hasn't always translated into families having access to that support at a public health level. So there's a bit of a mismatch between what we know from the science and what comes through from that science on the ground. And Jack Shonkoff highlights that here really nicely in terms of really urging us as a field to develop new strategies to produce larger, more scalable impacts for child development, working with families and the system. So we can see the challenge really quite starkly in this work that was done by Barry Wright, Pascal Fearon, and a whole range of other academics doing a review of the evidence base in the UK and how that is used on the ground. And what they found was that many of the most commonly used interventions in the UK had a weak evidence base, and those with the strongest evidence base were not as widely used. And there's a whole range of factors for that. But that's a challenge to try and unpick some of that and of that mismatch between where the science lies and what's happening on the ground. So one of the things that we've been doing in the Pedal Centre over the last 10 or more years is testing early interventions that support children and families. And so one of those interventions that we've been looking at is the VIP intervention, so video feedback intervention to promote positive parenting and sensitive discipline. And one of the reasons that brought Paul to this work over 10 years ago now is that it was really showing promise in terms of being effective from really high quality studies. So in randomized control trials that had compared families who received the program to those who hadn't received the program across a whole range of different families from different backgrounds with different needs, we see this consistent signal that it's effective in changing parent behavior. So that's what those blue bars on this slide show that across all of these different groups that it had been tested in, it had made that change in parental sensitivity, so in that kind of nurturing, responsive relational care. And that red line just shows you what the average effect is. And for us as academics, we get quite excited when we see an effect size in that range, because we know that that's going to be a meaningful difference for children and families. So that brought Paul to thinking about what could this intervention offer the UK. So just to tell you a little bit more about the programme before we get into the research, for those of you who aren't familiar with VIP, it's a video feedback intervention, and it was developed in the Netherlands by Femi Juffer, Marion Bakermans-Kranenberg, and Marinus van Eisendoorn, very systematically based on what the evidence was telling us about that might be beneficial in terms of supporting that behaviour change. And providing that support for early relational care. It's underpinned by attachment theory and social learning theory, so quite unique in really being grounded in what we know about the importance of close bonds between caregivers and children, and also the importance of positive behaviour support when things can get a bit more tricky. The intervention works by having usually around 6 or 7 fortnightly sessions where a facilitator will go into the home. In this case, we worked with health visiting services, and they feedback on the subsequent session or the following week. They will take clips of what happened in the kind of everyday play interactions, mealtime, those sort of shared moments, and they'll explore those with the family, really celebrating and focusing and pausing in on those moments of connection when the relationship is coming to life. And that's really powerful for families and parents to see themselves as the role model of doing things well. And that's very much core. It's a strengths-based, collaborative and child-centered approach to supporting the relationship. So I'll show you a quick clip that tries to illustrate and bring to life what this looks like in practice. So, see, should be able to do this for you.
Hello. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Please come in. Thank you.
Each programme visit is split into 2 sections. The first part involves taking clips of parents and their child in everyday situations, like meal times and playing together. If there are 2 parents or caregivers taking part, then they are videoed separately at first. Later on in the programme visits, there would be some clips of everyone playing and interacting together.
Paw Patrol?
The second part of each of the programme visits would involve parents watching the clips taken in the previous visit with the member of our programme team, exploring their child's behaviour and communication. The focus is to learn more about your child by thinking about the positive moments, as well as working through ideas on how to manage the more challenging moments.
So that's just to bring the video feedback approach to life a little bit for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So we tested this using a randomized control trial, embedded mostly in health visiting services, where we sent out a questionnaire to over 2,000 children and families to see whether children might be experiencing behaviours that might suggest that they might benefit from an intervention that's really aimed at promoting behavioural well-being for children. We then selected 300 families who met that kind of eligibility criteria that we had, and half of those randomly received VIP, and the other half continued as normal, so with access to normal treatment as usual, as we would describe it. So support from GP, health visiting, those kind of supports that are already in the system. We checked back in with families again 5 months later when those who'd received the programme had finished doing so. And about 95% of families were still in the study then. And then we checked in 2 years later. And we had a similar kind of number of families still taking part to see how they were doing. All of that evidence is already out there. What's new and exciting is work that Laura's been very closely involved with, is following up these families now into for 6 years later after they join the study. So when children are an average age of 8, and that's quite unique to have that opportunity to follow families for so long. When you do a trial like this, you have to specify what is it that you're ultimately trying to change. And so for us, that was behavioural well-being for children, often described as externalizing behaviour. So really thinking about behaviours like temper tantrums, aggression, those sorts of behaviours, impulsivity, and whether the intervention was making a difference to families in that way. That's quite unique because, as we saw in one of the slides earlier on that showed that diagram with the bar charts, it's more typical to look at whether these interventions change parenting behaviour. That is really hard to do in itself, but it's even harder still to see whether that is making a difference in terms of children's outcomes. But we wanted to test if this was really working, could we see a change in children's behaviour? On this slide, you can see the difference between the group of families who received VIP. Can you see my cursor here over here? And then the control group. This is showing you our key measure of child behaviour at baseline, so before anyone had received anything, and then five months later. We see a difference between the two groups, so a treatment effect, so a difference that we can attribute to the VIP intervention of about 2 points on the scale, the interview that we used. And that's a significant difference, but we also think it's a meaningful difference because it's in the interview of child behavior, it's equivalent to a change between having daily tantrums, for example, to having tantrums maybe once or twice a week. So that we would expect, not that every family experience that change, but that's to indicative to kind of bring it to life a little bit. And we would expect that on average, if we're seeing that difference between the groups, it's a meaningful difference. Um, that was more or less sustained at the 2 year follow-up. And then we've had this really exciting opportunity to go back now, 6 years later, to see was there still any difference for families. We used a slightly different statistical approach using longitudinal Bayesian models, and that's because we couldn't change the number of families that were in the trial at that stage. So when you use this type of approach, what you get is a posterior probability of superiority. So what that means is what is the probability that VIP might be superior to treatment as usual. We had 81% of the original families, so 244 of the 300 taking part when the children were aged 8. And what we found was that there was a superiority of VIP of about 86%, so with probability of superiority. And again, we saw a difference on this key behavior measure, which was reduced to about a 1 point difference on this scale. So that's a difference between having quite marked tantrums to having milder tantrums, so more destructive tantrums, to maybe stomping your feet, those sorts of things. The kind of 8-year-old equivalent of that. And we still see this small but meaningful effect size that suggests that there's a change between the two groups that's sustained over time. We've also been able to look at other outcomes across the study, and we see we have evidence that it's changing parental sensitivity, so that responsiveness, as you would expect, that those differences in children's outcomes are being driven by what parents and caregivers are bringing to the interactions with their children. And we're also really strikingly seeing differences in children's executive function, their ability to delay gratification, and the coherent way they think of relationships, and their kind of inner world, which we measure through story STEM. So we see more coherence in how children think about relationships if they were families had received the VIP intervention than if they were in the treatment as usual group. So that's really quite striking to us, that it's showing up in the way that children directly are experiencing their worlds. So can we be confident in these findings? Well, as Sal mentioned, one thing that was really important to us is that we wanted to test this in the real world. And health visiting staff, despite being incredibly busy in frontline services, were able to deliver the intervention. So we know that if we were to test it in the real world, which we've done, we do see this effect. There were low levels of dropout, and good engagement with the program. So most families who were offered the program took it up and completed all the visits. And the program was delivered really well, and to a high fidelity as well. So we can be confident that it's the intervention driving these changes. So what does this mean in terms of take-home messages? We have this really robust trial evidence now conducted in routine real-world services that shows that early relational support, when it's delivered in those trusting relationships, can make a difference to children and families all the way through into middle childhood. So this is something that we talk a lot about in the UK, the importance of early intervention, the importance of early relational support, but we haven't had much domestic evidence to support this. So we hope that this is a real contribution. You can find out more by reading some of the papers that we've published. But I wanted to finish up before I hand over to Claire with inviting some thinking and some questions about the kind of wider system. So what do these findings mean for the early years system? Well, as Sal mentioned earlier, interventions aren't these isolated solutions. They need to sit within a strong relational system that surrounds families. So we really need a whole system approach. We also, if we want families to access the best possible evidence-based support, we need to both resource those interventions, but we also need to resource the science of scaling them well. And I think these findings and other work in the system encourages us to think about, well, what would an evidence-informed early years system look like? So I just want to touch and dive into these a little bit more before we finish up. So obviously these interventions don't exist in silos, and children and families don't exist in silos. So we need to take this whole system approach where we're providing this support to families, but we're also conscious of all of the other factors and influences, and trying to act on those too, in terms of reducing those pressures on families, which are also going to show up in terms of relational health. We also, in the same way, need a whole system approach to effective interventions. And this is where I think we really need to stretch ourselves in the academic community. So we've done a lot of thinking at the top of this pyramid about how do we change child social emotional well-being, children's behaviour outcomes, through the next level in the pyramid, through building the relationship and relational skills. But we really need to do a lot more thinking about the next two levels. And what does it take for there to be workforce capability to support that? What are the systems conditions that need to be in place? So this trial demonstrates system capacity, but what needs to be there and sustained to make that happen? So we need to think about, well, what's the science that sits behind this? What can the academic community contribute to this? And I really like this quote from a book on this. It says, the science of scaling early childhood programs is one of the greatest public policy issues of our time. It's a real call to action for the academic community to move beyond randomized control trials, to really think about using implementation science to understand context as data, to co-produce and work alongside families, services, practitioners, and system actors, policymakers, to really think about what is it going to take to deliver an evidence-informed system for the early years. Working across the system, not just in specific interventions, but in supporting workforce capability across all of the touch points that families have. So we're really keen to have people's take on any of this, and to get into the discussion. Here are some resources that you can check out on the PEDAL website. The fantastic toolkit to support legal action for early childhood mental health that was done through Sal's work on behalf of PEDAL, and then also Joanna Moody at UNICEF, and then other PEDAL resources on our PEDAL Hub. So just to finish up by saying thank you to Laura, to all of our colleagues and all of the families who make our work possible. I'll stop sharing now. And hand over to Clare.
Thanks, Christine. Right, let me just share my slides for you. Christine, I can only see you, so if you can give me a thumbs up before you disappear, you can see those. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and great segue as well, because my part of the webinar today is to talk a little bit more about how you do try and think about embedding those interventions at scale, and how you also think about building a relational system too. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Clare Law. I'm the director of Better Start, which, for those of you who are not familiar, is a lottery-funded initiative aimed at transforming the lives of babies, young children and their families. We started our journey way back in 2015, and yeah, over a decade, we have learned an incredible amount along the way, and not just about what you can do to make a difference in the early years, but crucially how you do that and how you embed things that work for the longer term. So whilst we are now helping families right across the country, what I want to share today is about where our journey started in Blackpool, and how we focused our efforts in creating the conditions for change and achieving our ambition of Blackpool becoming a place that prioritises early relationships, a place where this is the golden thread running through every contact with every family, through the workforce and through the system, from pregnancy right through to early childhood. So, and crucially, relational interventions can't exist in isolation, as we've just heard. They only create real lasting change when they are held within and reinforced by a wider relational system. So a single programme can absolutely strengthen a parent-infant relationship, but if the surrounding services are rushed, transactional, or operating from different assumptions, then the impact really fragments. So relational practice needs to be interrelated with the system. So a shared language, shared principles, consistent relational experiences across those touch points that Christine referred to as well. So in Blackpool, where many families have experienced adversity, disrupted attachments, and lots of our communities have a low trust rate in services as well, we learned something really essential, was that relationships aren't just part of the intervention, they really are the intervention themselves. So relational practice is powerful because it strengthens parents, and it helps to reduce the stresses and the pressures and barriers that make daily life harder, and it helps families to feel safe and understood and to be able to ask for support without fear or judgment. And when we work in this way, parents become more confident and emotionally equipped, and babies receive the responsive, attuned caregiving that builds healthy brain development and those longer term outcomes. So as a town, we made a really strategic choice that we won't just deliver relational programs, we will build this whole relational system that builds parents' capabilities and removes the barriers that they face. So we stopped thinking in siloed projects and services and tried to shift to a more developmental pathway. And I've got an ex-colleague that always used to talk about Blackpool and say we've had more pilots in Blackpool than Manchester Airport. And so we were in this kind of cycle of testing things. And then when the funding went, or we struggled then to put them into business as usual, things went away again, and we kind of had to start again. So we wanted to move away from that. And we asked ourselves, what do families need relationally at each stage? So pregnancy, infancy, and the early years, and how do our interventions align to that? And as you can see here, we take this progressive universalism approach to doing this. So support for everybody, but with increasing intensity and depth for families who need more. And that means that every family in Blackpool can access relationally grounded support, while those facing greater adversity, trauma, or complexity receive additional targeted relational interventions. And it allows the whole population to benefit, whilst ensuring that we do wrap more closely around the families who need us most, and without stigma, thresholds, or those fragmented offers. And so I'm just going to walk you through that journey and then share how we've embedded this so it is now business as usual in Blackpool. So first, just a nod to health visiting in Blackpool, because we're so proud of the offer that we've got, because all of our work is underpinned by our enhanced health visiting offer. And in Blackpool, we provide more contacts and more continuity, and that means ultimately more time with families as well. So those additional touch points that we've built in mean that practitioners can build stronger and more trusting relationships and pick up on emerging needs earlier and create consistent relational experience right across the early years. So the enhanced offer really strengthens the whole relational system, because when health visiting is relational, frequent and attuned, every other intervention lands more deeply and more effectively. So I'm just going to talk you through a little bit through, and this is just a couple of examples of kind of what we provide in pregnancy. And our journey starts antenatally with a program called Baby Steps, which was developed in partnership with the NSPCC and Warwick University, and Sal also very instrumental in this program. It's not just about practical birth preparation, but it's emotional preparation for becoming a caregiver. And we focus on that reflective capacity, so helping parents notice their own responses, their own histories, and how these influence connection with their unborn baby and then their baby. So for many, it's the first time that anyone has offered a genuinely safe, reflective space around parenting. So we focus less on labour and birth and more about that transition to parenthood and what that means. And then the other programme I just wanted to touch on is called For Baby's Sake, developed by the For Baby's Sake Trust, for families where there's domestic abuse or complex trauma. And it is one of our most ambitious relational models. It works with both parents through pregnancy and beyond, addressing patterns and harm that could affect the baby. And it holds compassion and accountability together and supports new patterns of relating and crucially protects the baby by strengthening that caregiving both before and after birth. And then once the baby arrives, we move forward kind of into the new part of the developmental pathway. And again, these are a couple of the services and interventions that we provide. So the specialist parent-infant relationship service that we've got supports early relationships where bonding or emotional connection is fragile. And the stance is really kind of being with and not doing to. And practitioners create this holding environment where parents feel seen and not judged, and build the confidence and emotional capacity needed for that attuned caregiving. So certainly not a tick box visit, and it's more about relational containment. And then we also implemented video interaction guidance, or VIG. And as you've just heard, this kind of highlights those micro moments of success, those tiny instants when parents and children are in tune. And we slow those interactions down, watch the brief videos together of those real positive moments of attunement, and help parents to see that they can do this. And it goes back to the model of change that I showed earlier, where we're trying to build up their capability and their belief in themselves. And they can see that they've already got this great connection with their child or their baby, however kind of small those moments might be. And like I say, it's really transformative for self-efficacy, and develops also the relational skills of the workforce as well in practicing that. And just to say, actually, the VIG element is also, we've got practitioners in the pairs service trained in this method. We also have health visitors trained in this. It's part of the Baby Steps programme, and it's also part of the For Baby's Sake programme that we've got. So we're really trying to create this consistent offer right across an entire workforce. And then our speech, language and communication work is multifaceted and quite complex, as you can see, but also really deeply relational. And Sal kind of mentioned earlier about, this kind of focus on school readiness, and particularly, lots of thinking around the importance of speech, language and communication in school readiness. But we're grounding this very much in this relational approach that we start right from the off. We're talking about serve and return interactions, that shared attention, modelling language, and these are all acts of connection. And our speech, language and communication strategy has created a shared relational language across early years settings, home visiting, family hubs and health services. And we're now also, surprise, surprise, testing the use of video interaction guidance within our speech, language and communication pathway. And then just to touch on, kind of at the sharpest edge. So we apply relational principles even in the most emotionally charged situations when a baby enters care. And we've developed a Born into Care, what we call our WAVES team. And this reduces trauma at removal and supports parents with dignity and containment to try and create as much relational continuity for that baby as possible. And it also helps social workers practice in ways that regulate rather than escalate. And, our social care teams have been on a really transformative journey as we have co-designed this particular programme with families who have had experience of this system, which has traumatised them previously. So it is really relational practice under pressure, but we're in our very early stages of this programme, but starting to see some positive impacts. So the thread that links it all, which is this kind of relational system. So yes, we absolutely have interventions, and we have been really fortunate with some of the lottery investment that we've had, which has meant that we've been able to test and learn around some interventions and help our local commissioners make better and more evidence-informed decisions about the services that they continue to fund and those that maybe need to be decommissioned. But some of the most important learning that we've had is around stuff that just doesn't cost kind of any money at all. And so we've got this real story about the system that we have built around these interventions. So across maternity, health visiting, family hubs, early years and social care, we've aligned around these shared principles. So around attunement, curiosity, kind of how we connect and integrate with each other, how we create together, and how we lead by example. And we've created a new culture and way of working and created consistency in our values as leaders and as systems builders. So we're also actively trying to reduce a system that kind of creates trauma by slowing down where it matters and giving space for trust and to grow, and using consistent relational language right across agencies. So the way I've described it, I guess, probably sounds quite simple, but we know from some of the things that Christine talked about before that there are huge challenges in how you embed services and how you kind of grow a system that is relational, because implementing relational practice at scale is definitely far from simple. It's not a toolkit that we hand out or a one-off training or any kind of quick fix. And in Blackpool, over the kind of decade that we've been working there, we've seen a number of challenges kind of consistently show up. But these three in particular that I just wanted to highlight. So the first challenge is that systems tend to be built more for compliance rather than connection. So public systems, and particularly those around risk and safeguarding, tend to be designed more for processes, for thresholds, and for those kind of performance indicators. And it's not that those aren't important, but they don't naturally make space for slowing down, for listening, or for building trust. And so early on, the work for us was to create room for relational practice within a pressured machine. And then challenge 2 was around the workforce kind of needing that containment too. So we talk about parents needing co-regulation, but practitioners really do too. And so many of them were exhausted or carrying secondary trauma, high caseloads, worried that maybe slowing down might make them look less capable of doing their job. So we had to create the same conditions for staff that we wanted them to create for families. So all around safety and trust and reflective space. And actually, I guess, just a permission to be human. And then challenge 3 was around this, how do we get consistency across agencies? It's incredibly difficult. And it's, relational practice really can fall apart if each agency is using different language, or if one partner is working relationally and another partner might be working more transactionally. And so we saw families getting lots of mixed messages. So aligning partners definitely became non-negotiable. So how did we make this type of approach business as usual in Blackpool? So we developed some shared principles for the whole system. So whether you're a midwife or a social worker or a VIG guider, we agreed the same relational values around attunement and containment and curiosity and all those things that I described earlier. We invested in reflective supervision at scale. So moving supervision from a compliance task or feeling like more of a one-to-one, and really trying to create a space that was consistent across organisations and really supporting the workforce that could unlock this relational work that we really wanted to see. We remove process barriers where possible, so kind of use our governance and our leadership to think about what levers could we pull to make sure that people could focus on the things that they needed to be focusing on. And we challenged, things that we thought were there that maybe didn't need to be, and try to introduce things that would help. Multi-agency learning that is relational in itself. So, as I said before, it's not a quick fix. So we're not kind of offering one-off training, but we learn together kind of and reflectively and using some of the principles of interventions like VIG as those building blocks of this one kind of coherent culture that we wanted to move towards. We also thought about our outcomes and how we celebrated different outcomes and focused more on kind of relational outcomes. So legitimizing outcomes like parental reflection, trusting practitioners, and also focusing on the quality of the delivery. Because we know so many of these interventions are really well tested that I think often we can be at risk of trying to prove what's already been proven. And actually the most important learning is, well, are you delivering what you're meant to be with quality and developing really great relationships? And also what are we learning about implementation? And those are the things that we tended to focus on rather than trying to evidence impact of interventions that were already well tested. And then leadership that models the work. So leaders making space for listening and thinking, and so getting people to model kind of calm curiosity and compassion, and again that's where our kind of governance in Blackpool and the backing that we've got of some really senior exec leadership can be a make or break for a system, certainly. So when people ask me about interventions in Blackpool, I say we don't have a long list of projects. What we do have, though, is a really relational pathway and a relational system. So whether we're talking about health visiting or baby steps, pairs, VIG for baby's sake, or some of the born into care work, these are really just expressions of that one vision that every family is met with compassion, every baby experiences attuned care, and every practitioner is supported to build those authentic healing relationships. And that's ultimately how we will make that generational change and how relational practice and interventions become business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. That was brilliant. And what I thought to be left with, every baby being met with compassion. Love that. Thank you, Christine, too, for your presentation. It was really lovely to kind of start with that zoom in on the detail of a particular intervention and then think about actually what does that mean for systems as well, and how does that relational work go across from the kind of micro to the macro. I would really like to encourage people who are watching to put some questions or reflections into the Q&A for Christine and Claire. I'm going to ask a first question for you both while we're waiting for other people to ask some questions, although there's a couple in there already. There's huge richness from what you've both presented. If you were just talking to somebody who's in another local area thinking about, okay, maybe it's in England and they've just got some best start in life money and what should they do? If you had kind of one recommendation or take home message, what would it be? Maybe I should have just told you this in advance, not just landed.
No, it's fine. I just okay, I'll kick off. So I think probably won't come as any surprise to people to hear that I guess there tends to still be, I think, a focus on this menu of interventions and pick from one of these because find one that might work best for your area and kind of drop it in and land it in, and that I think people then expect the same outcomes to be exactly replicated. And so I think for me there needs to be that thought and that greater investment in the implementation piece, in how you spend time testing and learning and trying to do that kind of rapid cycle testing as well, because babies can't wait either. And so if you know that some things not working, to try and build something in that means that you've got some flexibility and freedom to kind of make some tweaks and changes to make sure that it fits right for parents in a particular local area, because every area has its kind of nuances. And I think still it's just something that is not paid attention to. And then it does these brilliant interventions and programs, like Healthy Start, Happy Start, that just need a little bit more kind of scaffolding and support in relation to the system that I think would maximize the potential that those interventions, really, really hold, because they're brilliant, and we just need to unlock it so that we can sustain them in the longer term and, reach even more families with those interventions.
Thanks, Claire. Christine?
Yeah, I hope what the trial might offer is really legitimizing what people already know on the ground is relationships drive change. They're precious in and of themselves, and we need to treat them in a way that protects that. But also, if we want to make a difference to children and families, then we need to support all of the range of different factors and systems that affect the relationship. And like we do in video feedback, if a local system came to me, I'd be saying, well, take a step back and think about what you're already doing well. Like, what is it that you're already doing in your system to support the relationship? And I think the toolkit, the Pedal UNICEF toolkit, is a great way of thinking about that and surfacing some of what's already happening, that people are doing well. The Shaping Us framework, the Thriving Together framework really help us think about, well, what does this look like in practice? What does relational support look like in practice, and what are the relational skills that we really want to support in caregivers? And then we can think about what's already strong in the system, and then learning from, I was just blown away by Claire's presentation about that, how they've really taken that and implemented on the ground. So learning, and we have the Parent Infant Foundation, learning from other places, place-based approaches to think about how we can shore that up in other areas. So really coming together, valuing the relationship and thinking about what are other people doing, what are we already doing, to make it work.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've got a few questions, which I'm just going to work through. One of them is around speech and language. So Catherine reflects on how there are some commonalities between Happy Start, Healthy Start, and some of the stuff they're doing in preventative speech and language therapy. And also, Claire, you obviously mentioned about potentially increasing use of video in that pathway as well. So I wondered if you had any data on those outcomes in children in the trial, or just any reflections on how it might support those outcomes as well as those behavioural outcomes.
Such an interesting question. Thank you so much, Catherine. I think when we started this, we were really interested in that behavioural well-being side, of course, knowing that these are related. But what's come through the work and through the evidence that's come out, there's a really lovely review that demonstrates that sensitivity is a pathway for speech, language, and communication skills. So through that sensitive responding, you can drive benefit there. So really evidences what is probably already known on the ground. And so we did include measures in the 6-year follow-up to look at language, and we have permission to look at linked data, early education data as well. So we haven't done that yet fully in the way that we want to, but I think we've got a good evidence-based hypothesis for why we might see change in speech, language, and communication, because so much of that, I always say that the home learning environment is relational. So that, all of this is happening in the context of the relationship. And we've had really exciting conversations with our colleagues in VIG and in our work on Playtime with Books, which is relational as well, but has more of a language focus, really thinking about how we can do that work.
Thank you. And that actually links to another question, because Hilary has asked about Playtime with Books and how this fits together, and whether that might be something that also fits in the Blackpool pathways as well. So I wonder if you wanted to say a little bit about Playtime with Books and the similarities and differences from Healthy Start, Happy Start, and then a bit of reflection on how that fits into these systems that we're describing as well.
I think, thank you so much, Hilary. It's great to link the two together. We very much took our learning from this work in developing Playtime with Books, which is another brief intervention to support shared book sharing in the home, moments of connection around books that really catalyze and set families off on a good learning pathway for language. And what we did in that work was, we knew the video feedback was so powerful. So we lifted a lot of what we knew and thought about, well, how can we do this in a very efficient, practical way to support something that has more of a language goal. And so please really encourage people to link to get in touch with us about Playtime with Books as well, because it is more of a language focus, but it uses the relationship and uses video feedback as a vehicle to show caregivers who might, for a whole host of reasons, not think of books and not think of language in that way, and may not have the confidence to get started with book sharing, using video feedback as a way of showing them, yes, you can, and you're doing it in this brilliant way already, and building their confidence and capacity in that space. So we're really excited to explore that more with Hilary and others about how we can use video feedback in VIG, in VIPP, in other contexts, to drive that change for families and support those lovely, joyful moments with books.
Thanks, Christine. Claire, have you got any reflections on, you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation already, but kind of where video helps in different pathways around maybe speech and language as well as parent relationship and mental health support?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have, and it's lovely to know that Hilary's on the call. Yeah, we have really entrenched video interaction guidance in pretty much everything that we have done, and that's part of, you know, us wanting to make sure that families are experiencing this kind of consistent offer. So no matter what service they're in, and even if people aren't in a position to be able to use video feedback methods, that they're still kind of getting that positive reinforcement and that we're building on people's strengths. So yeah, it's been, and it's something that's evolved over time, really kind of naturally and organically. You know, it's not something that you can just drop in. As I said earlier, it's had to, you know, we've tested and tweaked and found out kind of what works for the workforce. And then, you know, some interventions have come with video feedback kind of, you know, integrated already. And then others, like our speech, language and communication pathway, we're only just now at the point where we're starting to think, okay, actually, how could we enhance this offer even more with some video feedback? Really interested in the kind of books initiative, and particularly, you know, lots of our parents in Blackpool, you know, we have quite considerably low literacy rates, and there's quite a fear around kind of books and story sharing. And so we've been doing lots of work right through from baby steps to think about how can we take the stigma and kind of shame away from books and to use them in a slightly different way. So we're doing lots of that already, but yeah, there's huge potential for us to do more, definitely.
Yeah, I think there's something really nice, isn't there, about just that ethos of reflecting back to parents whatever they're doing already, whether that's book sharing if they don't feel confident sharing books, or whether that's around playing with their child, the mechanism of showing them through video or just through verbal feedback what they're already doing, and then using that as a way to make change. Such a nice strengths-based approach. Thank you. A question from Debbie here, who picked up on the evidence you mentioned, Christine, about why most effective interventions are not commonly delivered. And if you had any reflections, and I think we've already touched on this a bit, about why those effective interventions aren't always commonly delivered. And Debbie's question is, how can we change that? But I also wonder whether there's a reflection there on just it's not necessarily a fault in the system that it's not affecting the evidence-based interventions. It's maybe it's a mismatch between the two worlds, and maybe you've got some thoughts on that.
I think it's about having, I don't have this fully figured out, and that's why it's really useful to come to discussions like this to hear from others. But I think one of the challenges in that space is how we think about evidence. And that quote from Jack Shonkoff is really encouraging us to think differently about evidence, because that tells us something about the system, and that intelligence lies with the people who are delivering work on the ground, because they're using what they think is working. And there's two elements to that. So one is that if you privilege only RCT evidence, you'll get sometimes a lovely trial that demonstrates something effective without necessarily the systems thinking about how does this match the priorities of people on the ground. And I think that work can still be done. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and. And also understanding what those priorities are in the system and using that to help match people to approaches, and not a menu of interventions that Claire said, but is it that people are valuing relational work? Well, how do we dial that up in what we're offering? So we need a much more nuanced way of thinking about evidence, so that we're not just offering and not just thinking about it as a list of and whether things tick evidence thresholds or not, but thinking about what are the priorities in the system and how do we get evidence-based programs to work more flexibly for people as well. And rethinking things like fidelity, which is very kind of compliance orientated, to kind of relational integrity. So how can we flex what we're doing to make it more useful to people, but really keep the integrity of the relational approach at the heart of it? So that's not a neat answer to Debbie's question, but I don't think it's as clear cut as something's not working. I think it's about complexity, about the system and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. That's really thoughtful. And I think, Claire, you reflected when you were talking about this kind of the need for the test and learn, the need to understand that fit between an intervention and a system that goes both ways. And I wondered, Claire, from the kind of being in the system end, if you had any recommendations for academics on the call about developing and testing interventions in a way that supports that kind of implementation in practice, rather than potentially that sort of petri dish testing, which then struggles to hit reality.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and I think what we've worked really hard over the last decade on is trying to find that sweet spot, I guess, between not losing the integrity and the core components of an intervention that makes it work and makes it the thing that is going to transform outcomes, but then equally not being so wedded to that and fidelity to a particular model that actually it's so out of touch with reality that there's no way, we're doing a disservice to families that we're then not able to connect that brilliant science and evidence into the real world. And so we've kind of very much moved to kind of talking about real world evidence. And Christine's point about, well, what does class as evidence is such a great question that we've been asking ourselves, for a long time now, and trying to think slightly differently about it. But, I think it's criminal for interventions to be shut away somewhere with this great evidence. We need to pay more attention to how do we make them work in a system, how do we utilize the knowledge not only of the workforce but also communities and parents themselves to give us that feedback, and then for us to move on. We have to create the conditions to be able to move on that quickly, because we can't be waiting for another 5 or 10 years for it, because then by that point think the world has moved on again. So we have to do these things quickly.
Thanks, Claire. There's a couple of questions which are just a little bit more about the detail of Healthy Start, Happy Start. So I'm going to merge those together and ask you those, Christine. Neither of them have names attached. So one is about the practitioner's level of expertise, and so what training and then kind of quality assurance was around the VIT practitioners in Healthy Start, Happy Start. And then a second question was around disabled children and families, and how they were included in the trial, and if they had any different experiences or outcomes.
So VIP can be offered to or can be used by people from a range of different backgrounds. So you don't necessarily need a certain prerequisite of training. We offer a 5-day training, so it's 4 days, and then tailored to whatever version of VIPP. For example, Kirsten Barnecott's doing work on VIP in perinatal services. So the 5th day usually has a think about how it's being used on the ground. And then the question about how children and families with disability were included, is that right? So that wasn't something that we focused on in the trial, because often trials have strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, and a lot of disability isn't necessarily evident at 1 and 2 and might emerge. So lots of children went on to have neurodevelopmental issues or disabilities or needs. But one of the things about video feedbacks that's really powerful is it is individualized to the dyad. So whatever the needs, neurodiversity, disability is of that child, and then what they're bringing to the interaction and the caregiver, of course, you can work with. So it's really flexible and child-centered and strength-focused in that way. So, and I think that's really encouraging. So it wasn't a focus of our work necessarily, but it has been in other people who've used VIPP.
Thank you. A question here for you, Claire. How can leaders in a place progress from being colleagues responsible for different bits of the system to a team working together for that place? Which is a lovely way of describing, I think, some of the journey you've been on in Blackpool. How do you have any tips on how to get partnerships where they need to be?
So I would say a couple of tips. One would be you've got to create a vision and take people on that journey to that vision. So then it doesn't matter which part of the system you feel like you're individually responsible for, but you know the part that you have to play then. And I think if you can create this kind of North Star around, whatever the subject area might be, then that kind of naturally means that people start to gravitate to this kind of central point and to think more holistically about a problem. And so that would be, don't underestimate the importance. And you might think you've got a shared vision, and we've worked with some areas recently where they said, "Oh, we've got this vision," and then you ask everybody what the vision is from different organisations, and everybody says something completely different, but they think they're talking about the same thing, and they're not. So invest time in that vision setting. And then also the other thing that's really worked for us is our governance structure and how we've brought senior leaders, operational leaders, and communities together around this one vision. So you create the vision, then you need the structures around it. And people are really busy at board meetings, etc. And you sell that vision well enough, people don't feel like it's an extra thing to do. They feel like it is integral to their job to be at what we have is a Better Start executive, operational, sustainability, and kind of community board where everybody is playing their part and everybody's responsible for joint decision making. And also then you get that joint challenge as well. So for us, no decisions about 0 to 4s happen within any individual service. It has to come through that governance structure, and we challenge each other around that, and we crucially hold each other to account as well, because social care have got Ofsted in, or the hospital have got the CQC in. There are different priorities, there's different things going on, but that is a kind of platform which enables us to say, actually, and this could help you in those things as well. So to think about those kind of kind of quick wins and those things that will help people out with the challenges that they are facing within their own individual organisation. So vision setting and create a governance structure that enables you to kind of work towards that vision together.
Brilliant. Right, well, we're slightly over time, but thank you. That was such a rich webinar. Just so much wisdom and insight from both of you. And thank you to everybody watching, because there's some really thoughtful questions there and comments as well. So I'm going to close, but the recording will be available of this webinar and the slides and the contact details of everybody involved. So please, if you've been watching and you want to follow up any of these discussions or think about what this means for you, and you want some specific advice from Christine or Claire about your system, then do follow up, and let's continue working together to support each other with some shared endeavour around importance of early relationships. So thank you, and have a good Friday afternoon and a weekend when it arrives. Take care.
Bye.